Okay, today I'm doing the second fork off a 2000 CR125. Customer brought it in off the bike, which makes both of our lives easier, or at least easier on his wallet and easier on my space and my time. But this fork is common on earlier dirt bikes, not necessarily early, but after the millennium, through Kawasaki, a bunch of Yamahas, and of course the CR125. But I'm just gonna show you what you need, and then the steps you wanna take when you do this. As per usual, I'm a huge fan of All Balls Racing, but the Bushings kit is 386010, and the seal kit for oil and dust is 141 56-141. I think retail price on the two kits, you're going to look around 45 to 50 on the bushings, I think, maybe a little less, and then usually about 30 bucks for both pairs of seals. And then an impact for the bottom bolt. It's a 14 millimeter Allen, so you need one of these guys to get the bottom assembly off, basically, the bottom cap. The lock nut is a 19. And then the fork cap is a 19 millimeter. So you'll need two 19 millimeters. You have two wrenches or one ratchet socket wrench combination. Screwdrivers. I use a long one to set the compression and the rebound settings at their softest prior to disassembly. And then assorted pick tools make your life a little bit easier, getting the snap ring out and the dust seal free and things of that nature. As for less common tools, blue Loctite for the bottom, grease for the seals, fork oil of your choice, damper rod holder tool. This is not required. There are other ways to do this. I have the Motion Pro one that I use fairly often. It works great, fits multiple thread sizes and pitches. 46 millimeter fork seal driver. To drive the seals, metric measuring tape to measure the, it's in the corner, to measure the oil level. You can also use a set of calipers or anything that you can throw into the inner tube while holding to measure where the fluid level is at. It's a Motion Pro fork seal bullet over there. Tape or a plastic bag works the exact same way. And then a measuring cup for the oil, of course. In preparation, you want to make sure that you have everything you need, because the worst part about doing a fork job is probably getting it all disassembled and then realizing you have something you don't have something that you need, or you make a mistake and you have to take it all apart and do it all over again. So make sure you have everything you need. But as for information when you do forks, you typically need a few things. So one thing you need to know is the spring free length service limit. So when you take the fork apart and measure the spring at rest in inches or millimeters, both values are typically provided. You need to know what the minimum value or the least length is before the spring is at a service limit. So you need to know that. You need to know how much oil, so either how much oil to pour in. The more accurate way of doing it, which is measuring the gap of air from the top to the oil level, and then you need to know the weight of the oil. So most dirt bike forks take 5 weight. I'm using Maxima Zero Friction 5 weight for this job. And then the last thing that's important to know is what the suspension settings were at prior to disassembly, what they set it at from the factory, and then how many total clicks or turns are available in the adjustment. So in this case, he has rebound 11 clicks out of 22 available, compression 13 clicks out of 20 available, and the standard Honda setting for the 2000 model year is 11 clicks out of compression and 9 clicks out of rebound. So again, having the information and having the tools you need to do this job are very, very important. Alright, so I'm going to start the disassembly of the fork here. This is an untouched fork by me. It's straight as I got it from the customer, just the second one. I've already done the first one. I'm checking the compression setting right now, so I'm counting the number of clicks that it goes in from the setting that it's initially at. I'm recording that number, and then I'm going to turn it all the way out, counting the number of clicks to take from 0 to all the way out, and recording that number. And then I'm going to transition to the rebound adjustment. There's a rubber plug in the bottom of these forks that needs to be removed. And then same thing, counting the number of clicks in, and then counting the number of total clicks out, recording both numbers. Transition to the fork cap first, 19 millimeter socket ratchet. The lock nut that you're going to grab is 19 millimeter as well. Obviously you need an opening and a wrench for that. Hold the lock nut, loosen the fork cap, and the fork cap will come off. There is an O-ring on the fork cap that gets replaced. Spring seat comes off next. There, out comes a spring. I'm going to loosen the lock nut. Out comes the lock nut. Rebound rod comes out. And there's an O-ring on the bottom of the damper rod right there that needs to be accounted for. Alright, I'm going to drain the oil. And now we're going to work on the bottom fork center bolt. Easiest way to do this is with an air impact. You just got to be cognizant of what you're doing. This is where that 14 millimeter Allen comes into play. But typically, if you're able to hold the damper rod assembly, you can crack the center bolt loose. That's what the oil looked like that came out of the bike, or the forks I should say. This is that handy dandy parts washer that I have. Every time I take forks apart, every single component goes through this parts washer. I believe that it makes a huge difference getting all the metal particles and all the old oil contaminants out of the fork components. I'm pushing up the dust seal right now with a screwdriver and a hammer. Now I'm taking out the stopper ring or the snap ring. And once you have done those two, or removed those two, you can separate the inner and the outer tube with forceful strikes, like so. Outer tube goes down, inner tube, here's your big bushing. Just say your slider bushing. There's your guide bushing. You can see how worn it is. The copper Teflon looking stuff is no longer there on the guide bushing. And the inner tube is done. Breakdown of the center bolt, you have two O-rings. Smaller one goes on top, and then the equivalent of like a big copper crush washer that goes along the bottom. And before and after of the inner tube or the fork legs, fork center bolt, that's your rebound adjuster. Fork cap, there's an O-ring to be replaced right above the threads, the outer threads. Lock nut. The inner tube cleaned and ready for assembly, ready to accept the bushings. So here's a breakdown of everything that comes in the bushings kit from All Balls Racing and where it all goes. So the first thing I'm doing is the bleed screw on the cap. There's a very, very small O-ring that comes with the kit. You remove that screw, bleed screw, and replace that O-ring. There's also an O-ring. The bigger O-ring at the top of the screen goes on the fork cap right above the threads. The small O-ring just above that is that O-ring that I said to pay attention to on the damper rod while I was taking the spring guide off. And then everything toward the bottom of the screen is basically the order that goes back on the fork leg when you're getting ready to mate the inner tube and the outer tube. The fork center bolt right above the orange pick, those are the three items that are replaced on the fork center bolt. Two O-rings, a smaller one toward the top in this case, away from the threads. And then the copper crush washer equivalent goes toward the bottom of the fork center bolt. That ring below the fork center bolt goes on the outer tube, which you will briefly see here in a moment. But as long as you keep everything organized and in order, you will be able to mate everything back up where it came from. It's if you're just throwing things in a box or a bin, where I can see this will get confusing. But you can always go on a Bike Minute or Partzilla and pull the parts diagram. There's that O-ring that I was talking about. Make sure you put that back on there. You can always get a parts diagram and piece it back together. The only bad thing about parts diagrams is it usually doesn't show you the size of things unless you click the details of the part. So just keep everything in order, keep everything organized, and you will find a way to be successful here. So fork center bolt, you got your copper O-ring, and then this last O-ring there goes toward the top / middle. There are channels and grooves in the fork center bolt. It will be apparent where you need to put these O-rings. Just pay attention as it comes off. This is that outer ring that I was talking about that goes on the outer tube that's being replaced right now. Right there. And now we're going to start assembly of the inner tube. Really the meat and potatoes of why you rebuild forks right here. So again, everything's got to be super clean here. Microfiber towels are awesome to have for this, but parts washer or parts cleaner, if you don't have a parts washer, I should say, microfiber cloth, you can achieve really the same result as long as you're patient. Notice that I have an index card throughout the video. That 1 cent tool in a pen makes life a lot easier. Instead of walking back and forth to a computer or just guessing, to know the specs and how much, and as regarding torque and oil and adjustments, things of that nature. Grease for seals and oil for bushings is what I always do here. Obviously, the orientation of the seals is important, and these are inverted forks, so depending on what you have worked on before, it's either very intuitive to you or it's opposite of intuitive. So again, just make sure you're paying attention here. All right, so in this case, the dust seal goes on first, and everything is going up into the outer tube. Stopper ring, oil seal goes on, so in this case, the words and numbers are going to go down. The oil cavity is going to go up toward the outer tube. You got your backup ring. This is your guide bushing, or small bushing as I call it. And you can see the huge difference between the two, new and used. And then you have your slider bushing. Again, you can see the huge difference between new and used here. Oil for the bushings. These forks look like they had been rebuilt before with seals, but I would imagine when that occurred, new bushings were not installed. Again, make sure everything's clean here when you go to mate the tubes. I think bushing should be done. Again, it's hard to say. People service things differently or at different intervals. If you're doing service regularly, I would say do bushings either every second or third service. But again, that's kind of done differently by people. And most of the time when I pull forks apart, they need bushings, which just kind of goes to show how often forks are serviced. Anyway, I think it was a 46 millimeter fork seal driver. And this is actually an eBay fork seal driver from China, which is about 25% to 35% of the cost of the Motion Pro one. And I just didn't have that Motion Pro size, so I got that cheap one. But it actually works just as well. It's not as weighted and solid as the Motion Pro one, but it works extremely well. So all that goes together. Fork oil seal gets driven, stopper ring goes in the channel above the oil seal, and then as for the driving the dust seal, I kind of caught this off Dave Moss, how he just jams the inner and the outer tube together to get the dust seal to seat, and it's worked for me. I've done that. I've been doing that for a few months now, and it's completely fine. But now we got to get the fork internals and the center bowl back together. So notice that the fork is complete, or the outer tube and the inner tube are completely compressed into each other right now. That's going to make your life easier. Make sure you have that O-ring on there. that I pointed out, and then make sure you put that partition plate, is what it's called. I thought it was a washer. It's called a partition plate back on the inner assembly. I feel like that's something that you could easily forget, and it can easily fall off while you're cleaning it. So make sure you're taking note of that. All right, blue Loctite for the fork center bolt threads, and the torque spec on this bolt is 40 foot-pounds. So there's a couple tricks here. You know, you can buy the tool. I typically use a battery-powered, never an air-powered impact to put it back on, usually just to get it off. The torque of a battery-powered impact is way less. But I usually start it by pushing the damper rod in or down toward the center bolt, and then usually once it's threaded, I can pull the damper rod away, and it will keep tension on it to seat, basically. We're going to measure fork spring free length. In this case, only on the 2000 CR125, the service limit is 467 millimeters. So that's a number that is regularly different, and you just have to know the service limit of the spring on what you're working on. In this case, they were at like 471 and 472, so he was fine. Spring guide goes on, narrow side goes down, lock nut is going to go on, damper rod is going to go back in, or I should say the rebound rod adjuster. Lock nut goes on hand tight, and this is what dictates how many clicks of adjustments you have. So if you don't do it right, if you don't seat the lock nut correctly, you're not going to have the correct number of clicks, I should say, when you go to do your adjustment. All right, oil goes in. Notice I'm supporting the fork leg at the bottom. On these inverted forks, you have to make sure you do that. I'm bleeding air from the system right now as I'm putting oil in. It's my Motion Pro damper rod holder. It's kind of helping me keep control of the damper rod, pump the air out or bleed the air out. And then it comes in handy when you go to put the spring in and the spring's in your way. But you know, there are other ways to do this. You don't need the tool. You can run a piece of wire around it, and whatever to fish the spring through. So you measure your fork oil level with the tube fully compressed. Your spring goes on, and then your spring seat goes on. And actually, his spring seat was in there upside down on this fork, which was surprising to me because that's like an obvious piece. It's got like a collar, and it needs to go down toward the spring. I'm not sure how that got in there backward, but so I'm going to tighten the fork cap. I'm just going to loosen the bleeder screw and bleed air, tighten it. Now I'm setting the compression adjustment. Now I'm just going to set the rebound adjustment. This is up to you. You know, set it at factory setting or you know, per the customer's preference. Install the rubber cap, clean everything off, check the dampening, everything is good. And then I like to package these up when customers bring in separate forks instead of on the bike. I like to just throw them in a plastic sleeve, so they are truly clean and ready to install once the customer picks them up.